Hi everyone, it's your friendly neighborhood biology professor with a little introduction to photosynthesis. We'll cover photosynthesis in more detail in Chapter 7, but for now we need to have a little introduction to allow you to enjoy your lab this week. The word photosynthesis gives you a key to what's going on in the process. Photo is light and synthesis is to make. So we are using light to make something. Organisms such as plants and some algae are photosynthetic. They use the energy in sunlight or solar energy to convert carbon dioxide and water into sugars. In the process, they also release oxygen. Directly or indirectly, these organisms pretty much feed the entire world. But remember, they're making these foods, these sugars, for themselves. We just happen to benefit from that by eating them. Here are some examples of photosynthetic organisms. Some of them are probably very familiar. Now we see a forest floor up at the top. Plants are usually the first thing that comes to mind when we think about photosynthesis. Unicellular protists, like the one shown here. Also multicellular protists, which are algae, shown on the left bottom. Some bacteria are also photosynthetic. Clearly they don't have chloroplasts because they don't have membrane-bound organelles, but they do have the machinery to do photosynthesis. And also some bacteria called purple sulfur bacteria are photosynthetic. The process of photosynthesis is very similar in all of these organisms. Some of the differences are going to be where things happen, since anything eukaryotic does have a chloroplast and anything prokaryotic does not, but the processes themselves are very, very similar. Here's a picture of a chloroplast that we are exploring in Chapter 4. The part that we're really going to be thinking about with photosynthesis is on the inside. These are called the thylakoids. They're almost like tiny little flattened pancakes of membrane with a space in the middle, and they're all interconnected. A lot of what happens in photosynthesis happens here on the inside of the chloroplast in these thylakoids. Just as an interesting note, photosynthetic bacteria, or prokaryotes that are photosynthetic, have infolded regions in their plasma membrane, so they can sort of duplicate this folded membranous structures with their plasma membranes. And it's in those infolded regions that you have the pigments and the enzymes for photosynthesis. So remember, we're here in the chloroplast. Photosynthesis takes place in the green organs of our plant, usually, or green protists. So when we think about green organs in the plant, we usually think leaves. Sometimes we're in the stem as well. So we're looking at the leaves of this plant. Carbon dioxide needs to come into the cells of the plant in order to be used for photosynthesis. So that carbon dioxide comes in pores called stomata on mostly the undersurface of the leaf. In these pores, when they're open, carbon dioxide goes in, and in the process of photosynthesis, oxygen is released. The oxygen is then either used by the organism, or if there's an excess, the oxygen is released through these stomata pores. So here's where we're having our gas exchange. The carbon dioxide goes in and is among these cells inside the leaf. The oxygen, when it's produced by these cells, if it's in excess, comes out. Chloroplasts are mostly found in special cells called mesophyll cells, and that's these cute little spongy cells within the leaf that you can see in this picture. It's not in the epidermal cells or the skin cells of the leaf. And often when we draw our cells, we tend to put a chloroplast or maybe a couple of chloroplasts, but in reality there are lots and lots of chloroplasts in some cells. There tend to be 30 to 40 of them. So if you look at the picture here, all those little green balls are chloroplasts. If we look at the chloroplast itself, the green pigment is called chlorophyll. So chlorophyll is the molecule that's very, very important to photosynthesis. It's also what makes plants green, or some algae green. that chlorophyll would be embedded in the thylakoid membrane. So if we look at these little thylakoid discs, we'd see chlorophyll in the membrane of those discs, also shown in the microscope picture of the chloroplast. As I mentioned, chlorophyll gives plants their green color. It's the green pigment in the chloroplasts. Chlorophyll is what absorbs the light energy and then directs that light energy to synthesize organic molecules, in this case sugars, in the chloroplast. So I have a picture of a leaf, nice green leaf. If we look inside the leaf, we would see chloroplasts, and there's one chloroplast here, and there's one chloroplast here. Right, these are chloroplasts that haven't been doing a lot of photosynthesis. Let's turn the light on 24 hours a day. And here's the chloroplast. This whole big thing that comes out of there is a big chloroplast. And this big thing, something that we talked about very, very briefly in Chapter 3, is a starch grain. So as the plant makes lots of sugars through photosynthesis, if it can't use them all, it stores them as these big grains of starch in the chloroplasts. This is a representation of a wavelength of light. You sort of think of it like a jump rope being pushed up and down. Right, light is actually a form of energy, and that's important to understanding what's going on with photosynthesis. It's solar energy. It's light energy. It's also called electromagnetic energy or electromagnetic radiation. Light behaves as little packets of energy called photons. And you'll hear physicists argue about this. Is light a particle? Is light a wave? For us, we kind of don't care. It's both. It's a particle that has a wave-like function. So you can think of light as having these wavelengths, and these wavelengths represent energy. So light, like other electromagnetic energy, travels in rhythmic waves. And how big the waves are, which means how close from peak to peak, is characteristic of each wavelength of light. So a wavelength is from one crest or one peak to the next. And we want to relate that to energy. How much energy is present in that light? So if we look at it, we have a short wavelength of light, and we have longer wavelengths of light. And the shorter wavelengths of light have higher energy. And that makes sense. Think about holding a jump rope between you and a friend. In order to make those short wavelengths, you have to move your hand up and down much faster than long, languid movements, which make longer wavelengths. This is kind of what light looks like, right? We have all of the electromagnetic spectrum here. Everything from gamma rays, X-rays, UV. Visible light is what we're going to be talking about, and then infrared, microwaves, and radio waves. So I want you to focus in on the visible light, because that's what we're going to be exploring with photosynthesis. Right, our shorter wavelengths are over on the left, in our purples, and our longer wavelengths are over on the right, in our reds. What that tells us is our purples are higher energy because they have shorter wavelengths, and our reds are lower energy because they have longer wavelengths. Now it may make sense to us to think about, well, of course the plant's going to use the higher energy wavelength, but not necessarily. You know, think about some experiences you may have. Sometimes the higher energy isn't the best way to get things done. Sometimes when we're cooking, if you start off at a very high energy, you end up with not a very good snack. Right? Think about cooking a big piece of meat. You might cook the outside if you heat it at a very high temperature, but if you have a very high temperature, you'll burn the outside before you get the inside cooked. So higher energy isn't necessarily better, and lower energy isn't necessarily worse. What we want to determine is which one do plants use, or do photosynthetic organisms use in photosynthesis. One of the ways that we think about this is what's absorbing the light energy. What's absorbing the light energy are the pigments. So pigments in general are molecules that absorb energy or light energy, and they're specific to what wavelength they use or absorb in the process. Specifically in photosynthesis, we're thinking about chlorophyll. What wavelength of light does chlorophyll absorb? And absorbing it means it must use it. Wavelengths that aren't absorbed are reflected or pass through the pigment. So in reality, we think about chlorophyll making plants green, but really what it's doing is chlorophyll is reflecting the green light back. It's not absorbing it. Any light that's absorbed by the pigment, you're not going to see that color. So the color that we see is green because the pigment reflects it or transmits it through. So leaves are green because they reflect green light. So we need to figure out, well, they reflect green, so we know green is not the wavelength that's used by plants for photosynthesis. What wavelengths are used?